In the late 16th century, England was not an empire. It was a nervous, damp island parked off the coast of a hostile continent. To the average Englishman looking across the channel, the world seemed to be closing in. The maps of the day were being drawn in Spanish gold. The galleons of King Philip II dominated the Atlantic, hauling the stolen wealth of the Aztecs and Incas back to Seville, funding the armies that threatened to extinguish the Protestant flame in Europe. England was late to the feast. It had no colonies, no gold mines, and no foothold in the New World. It had only the sea and the desperate, gnawing ambition of men who felt history leaving them behind. At the center of this anxiety stood a man who embodied the restless spirit of the age, Sir Walter Raleigh. He was a paradox, a poet who wrote of silence but lived for noise, a soldier who fought with brutal efficiency in Ireland, and a courtier who charmed Queen Elizabeth with the dangerous charisma of a pirate in velvet. Raleigh understood that if England remained confined to its island, it would die. He looked at the map of the Americas and saw not just a land of resources, but a strategic necessity. He needed a base. He needed a harbor hidden from the Spanish, from which English privateers could strike at the treasure fleets and bleed the Spanish Empire dry. In 1584, Raleigh secured a patent from the Queen. It was a document of breathtaking arrogance, granting him the right to discover, search, find out, and view such remote, heathen, and barbarous lands not actually possessed by any Christian prince. He did not sail himself. The Queen, possessive of her favorite, forbade him from risking his life at sea, but he was the architect of the dream. He outfitted 2 small ships, the Tiger and the Admiral, and placed them under the command of Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow. Their orders were simple: find the door to the New World, and make sure it opens for England. The voyage was a leap into the void. For weeks, they sailed the route of the trade winds, swinging south to the Canaries and the West Indies before turning north. They were navigating partly by chart, partly by rumor. And then, on the 2nd of July, they smelled it. Before they saw the land, they smelled the scent of a garden. Barlow wrote that the fragrance was as if we had been in the midst of some delicate garden abounding with all kind of odoriferous flowers. It was the smell of the American summer, drifting miles out to sea. 2 days later, they sighted the coast. It was the outer banks of what is now North Carolina, a thin, precarious ribbon of sand acting as a barrier between the violent Atlantic and the calm sounds behind. When the English waded ashore, they did not fall upon their knees to pray. They fell upon the grapes. The land was so overgrown with wild muscat and grapes that the surf was beating them into the ocean. They covered the shrubs, climbed the cedars, and carpeted the ground. To the sailors, accustomed to the hardtack and salt beef of the crossing, it felt as if they had stumbled into a vineyard planted by God. They raised the English flag and claimed the land for Elizabeth, unaware that they were standing on a shifting sandbar that would become one of the most treacherous graveyards in maritime history. The English spent weeks exploring this new world, unaware that it was an ancient one. The region was the home of the Secotan and the Croatoan peoples, societies that had managed the landscape for centuries. The English were not discovering a wilderness. They were trespassing in a neighborhood. The first contact was cautious but peaceful. On the 3rd day, a boat with 3 indigenous men approached the English ships. One of them boarded, and the English gave him a shirt and a hat and let him taste their wine. He returned to his boat and began to fish, filling the bottom of his canoe with the catch in minutes, which he then divided into 2 piles, one for each ship. It was a gesture of immediate, unprompted reciprocity. The major diplomatic breakthrough came when Granga Nemio, the brother of the local ruler Wingina, arrived with a retinue of 40 men. The English were struck by the dignity and order of the group. Granga Nemio sat on a long mat and beckoned the captains to sit beside him. He showed no fear of their clothes, their weapons, or their pale skin. He struck his head and his chest, and then theirs to signify that they were one. Trade began immediately, and it was here that the dangerous illusion of the Roanoke venture took root. The English had a tin dish, a cheap piece of kitchenware. Granganillo saw it and was mesmerized. He took the dish, punched a hole in the rim, and hung it around his neck as a breastplate. In exchange for this piece of tin, he gave the English 20 deer skins, worth countless times more, in London. To Amadas and Barlow, this was proof of the economic miracle waiting in America. They believed they had found a people who valued English trash as treasure, a marking of infinite profit. They did not understand that Granganillo was a shrewd leader operating within his own value system, acquiring exotic status symbols to bolster his prestige against rival tribes. The hospitality was overwhelming. When the English visited the village on Roanoke Island, a fortified town of cedar bark longhouses surrounded by fields of maize, Granganillo's wife received them. Her husband was away, but she ordered her people to carry the English from their boats to the shore so their feet would not get wet. She had their clothes washed and dried by the fire. She served them a feast of venison, fish, melons, and fruit. Barlow was intoxicated by the experience. He wrote home that we found the people most gentle, loving, and faithful, void of all guile and treason, and such as live after the manner of the Golden Age. It was a hallucination. The Golden Age Barlow described was actually a complex political society. The Secretan were wary of their inland enemies. They were curious about the English weapons, the thunder tubes that could kill from a distance. They were not naive children of Eden. They were strategic players looking for allies. But Barlow saw what he wanted to see. He saw land where the earth bringeth forth all things in abundance, as in the first creation, without toil or labor. He was writing a sales brochure, not a military report. When the ships prepared to return to England in September, they carried 2 prizes more valuable than the pearls and skins they had collected. 2 young men, Manteo of the Croatoan tribe and Wanchese of the Roanoke, agreed to accompany them to London. Their motivations were different. Manteo was an Anglophile, fascinated by the technology and the power of the strangers. Wanchese was a skeptic, a scout sent to peer into the belly of the beast and gauge the threat. Their arrival in London caused a sensation. They were living proof of Raleigh's triumph. They were paraded through the court, dressed in English doublets, learning the language, and teaching the mathematician Thomas Harriot the rudiments of the Algonquian tongue. Raleigh used them as props in his great theater of persuasion. He named the new land Virginia, a shrewd piece of flattery directed at the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth. He had a seal made for himself, Lord and Governor of Virginia. The mood in London was electric. The Queen, impressed by the reports of a land of eternal spring and docile natives, knighted Raleigh. Investors flocked to the cause. The dream of Virginia had been sold. It was a dream of easy wealth, of a strategic fortress that would humble Spain, and of a pagan people waiting eagerly to be civilized. But in the excitement, the warnings were ignored. No one paid attention to the treacherous shoals of the Outer Banks that nearly wrecked the ships. No one asked how a permanent colony would feed itself if the gentle people decided to stop sharing their corn. No one questioned whether the Golden Age would survive the arrival of hundreds of hungry armed soldiers. Raleigh, the Queen's pirate, had convinced England to bet everything on a paradise that existed largely in his own imagination. The curtain was rising on the first act of the tragedy, and the actors were about to be sent to a stage from which there was no return. In April of 1585, the dream of Virginia ceased to be a story told in London salons and became a hard, violent reality. Sir Walter Raleigh, forbidden by the Queen to leave her side, appointed his cousin, Sir Richard Grenville, to lead the fleet. 7 ships departed Plymouth, carrying 600 men. But these were not the farmers and artisans needed to build a society. They were the dogs of war. The passenger list was a roll call of veterans from the Irish campaigns and the wars in the Low Countries. They were men trained to burn, to besiege, and to occupy. They were sent to the New World not to plant corn, but to plant a flag. The voyage itself was a portent of the chaos to come. A storm off Portugal scattered the fleet. The flagship, The Tiger was separated and arrived at the Outer Banks weeks ahead of the supply ships. But in his haste to enter the inlet, Grenville ran the Tiger aground. For 2 hours, the ship beat against the shoal. The damage was catastrophic not to the hull, but to the cargo. The seawater flooded the hold, destroying the vast majority of the food supplies intended to sustain the colony through the winter. Before the first foundation was dug, the colony was already starving. When they finally landed on Roanoke Island, the military mindset took over. Under the command of Ralph Lane, a prickly and aggressive soldier, the English built a fort. It was not a village. It was a defensive earthwork shaped like a star, designed to repel a Spanish assault that never came. They built a jail before they built a church. They obsessed over gold, sending parties up the rivers to search for mines that didn't exist, while the fertile earth around them sat untilled. They were guests who had arrived with empty pockets and loaded muskets, expecting their hosts to feed them. The golden age of hospitality described by Barlow began to evaporate. The indigenous leader, Wingina, watched the new arrivals with growing alarm. He saw that they were helpless at gathering food, but terrifyingly efficient at violence. The tension snapped over a triviality. During an exploration of the mainland, a silver cup went missing from the English baggage. Grenville, believing it had been stolen by a local villager at Aquascogoc, ordered a reprisal that was shockingly disproportionate. He sent a detachment of soldiers to the village. They demanded the cup. When it was not produced, the English burned the village to the ground and destroyed the standing corn in the fields. It was a lesson in European justice. For 1 cup, a whole town would starve. When Grenville returned to England to fetch more supplies, he left Ralph Lane in charge of 108 men. Lane was a man wholly unsuited for diplomacy. As the winter of 1585 set in, the colony became a parasite on the local tribes. The English, unable to fish the shoals or hunt the deer with their clumsy matchlocks, demanded daily tributes of corn from Wingina. The chief, realizing that these strangers were not gods but merely incompetent invaders, began to withdraw. He moved his people from Roanoke Island to the mainland, taking the food with him. He famously told Lane that his god was stronger than the English god, because the English had no corn. Lane's paranoia grew with his hunger. He became convinced that Wingina, who had changed his name to Pemisipan to signify his shift in status, was plotting a great confederacy of tribes to wipe out the English. Lane decided to strike first. It was a preemptive coup born of fear. In June of 1586, under the guise of a parley, Lane marched his soldiers to Pemisipan's camp on the mainland. The encounter was a massacre. Lane gave the signal, "Christ our victory," and his men opened fire. Pemisipan was shot, fell to the ground, and then, feigning death, suddenly sprang up and ran into the woods. He was chased down by an Irish servant of Lane's, Edward Nugent. A few moments later, Nugent emerged from the forest carrying the chief's head. Lane took the grisly trophy back to the fort and mounted it on a pike. The bridge was burned. The English had decapitated the leadership of the very people they relied on for survival. The colony was now totally isolated. They were surrounded by enemies of their own making. The food was gone. The men were subsisting on oyster shells and dog meat. They scanned the horizon every day for Grenville's relief ships, but the ocean remained empty. Then, a miracle appeared, but not the one they expected. A massive fleet of 23 ships appeared on the horizon. It was Sir Francis Drake, fresh from sacking the Spanish Caribbean. He had come to check on his countrymen. When he saw the wretched state of Lane's colony, the starving soldiers, the rotting fort, the hostility of the land, he offered to take them home. Lane hesitated. He wanted to stay, to prove he hadn't failed. But then, a hurricane struck. The storm battered the fleet for days, sinking some of Drake's ships and terrifying the colonists. It was the breaking point. The soldiers mutinied against the idea of staying. They scrambled onto Drake's ships in a chaotic evacuation, leaving behind their baggage, their maps, and 3 men who were out on a mission in the interior. The colony of soldiers fled back to England, leaving Roanoke Island silent once more. Weeks later, Richard Grenville finally arrived with the relief supplies. He found the fort deserted. He found the body of one European man, hanged possibly a suicide, or a message from the locals. Grenville, stubborn and confused, made a fateful decision. He did not want to lose England's claim to the land. So, before he sailed away, he left a small holding force behind. 15 men. 15 men with limited food, left in a fort stained with the memory of murder, surrounded by the grieving and vengeful people of Pemasapan. They were a human sacrifice to the map, left to hold the door open for a return that might never come. By the spring of 1587, the experiment at Roanoke was widely considered a disaster. The soldiers had returned with nothing but complaints. The indigenous population had been alienated, and the fort was a rotting monument to English incompetence. But Sir Walter Raleigh was a man possessed by a vision that refused to die. He analyzed the failure of the Ralph Lane colony and realized the fundamental flaw. It had been a camp, not a community. Soldiers look for an exit. Families look for a home. If Virginia was to survive, it needed roots. It needed women and children. Raleigh conceived a new venture, incorporated as the governor and assistants of the city of Raleigh in Virginia. This was not a military expedition. It was a migration. He recruited 117 settlers, including 17 women and 9 children. These were middle-class Londoners, bricklayers, farmers, and artisans. Each promised 500 acres of land in the New World. They were people investing their lives in a future they had only seen in Raleigh's propaganda. To lead them, Raleigh chose an unlikely commander, John White. White was not a general or a sea dog. He was an artist. He had been on the previous voyages, documenting the flora and the people with his watercolors. He was a man of observation, deeply familiar with the landscape, and, crucially, a man who still believed in the possibility of coexistence. He was to be the governor of the new city of Raleigh. The plan was sound. They would avoid the blood-soaked soil of Roanoke Island. The pilot, Simon Fernandez, was instructed to take them north to the deep, calm waters of the Chesapeake Bay. There, far from the shoals and the angry subjects of the late Chief Wingina, they would build their city. It was a perfect plan, sabotaged before it even began by the malice of one man. Simon Fernandez, the Portuguese pilot hired to navigate the fleet, was a privateer at heart. He was known as the Swine by those who disliked him, a man who viewed the settlers not as his charge, but as cargo that was slowing him down. He wanted to get the colonists off his ships so he could hunt Spanish prizes in the Caribbean before the summer ended. The fleet arrived off the Outer Banks in July of 1587. The plan was merely to stop at Roanoke, briefly to check on the 15 men Grenville had left behind the previous year, and then move on to the Chesapeake. Governor White took a small boat toward the island, intending to conduct a quick search. But as the boat pulled away, Fernandez's voice boomed from the deck of the flagship, the Lion. He ordered the sailors not to bring the passengers back. "Summer is too far spent," he declared. He would not take them to the Chesapeake. They were to be dumped here on Roanoke, or they would not land at all. It was a mutiny of the most callous kind. John White, the gentle artist, found himself outmaneuvered by the brutal pragmatism of the sea captain. The settlers watched in horror as their destination shifted from the promised land of the Chesapeake to the haunted island of Roanoke. They were being forced to settle in a graveyard. When White and his men stepped ashore, the silence of the island was heavy. They walked to the site of the old fort, the earthworks Ralph Lane had built. It was overgrown with melons and wild vines, nature reclaiming the scar. They were looking for the 15 soldiers Grenville had left to hold the claim. They found no sentries. They found no flag. What they found was a single human skeleton, bleached by the sun, lying face down near the entrance of the fort. It was a stark, terrifying message. The bones told the story of a massacre. The local tribes, finally taking their revenge for the murder of their chief, had overwhelmed a small garrison. They had burned the buildings and chased the survivors into the sea. The 15 men had not just died, they had been erased. The psychological impact on the new settlers was devastating. They were standing in the ruins of a failed colony, surrounded by unseen eyes that had already tasted English blood. They had no fort. The houses were ruined, and their pilot had abandoned them. But they had no choice. They began to rebuild. They cleared the vines, repaired the rotting timbers of the cottages, and tried to make a home in the kill zone. The danger revealed itself almost immediately. A colonist named George Howe, a tailor by trade, went out alone to catch crabs in the shallow water of the Sound. He was not a soldier. He was a father trying to find dinner. He never returned. They found his body later, riddled with 16 arrows and his skull crushed. The war had not ended just because the people had changed. To the Shackleton, these were just more invaders. John White tried to salvage the situation through diplomacy. He had one ace up his sleeve, Manteo. The Croatoan man had returned with them from England, now fully acculturated and loyal to the English cause. On August 13th, in a ceremony that mixed feudalism with hope, Manteo was baptized as a Christian and declared the Lord of Roanoke and Dasamongapunk by the authority of Queen Elizabeth. It was the first Protestant baptism in the New World. It was meant to signal a new alliance, a bridge between the two worlds. But Manteo's loyalty could not shield them from the tragic momentum of the past. In a desperate attempt to avenge George Howe, White authorized a raid on a mainland village where the hostile Roanokes were rumored to be hiding. The English attacked at dawn, firing into the mist. When the smoke cleared, they realized with a sickening jolt that they had attacked the wrong people. They had fired upon the Croatoan Manteo's own tribe, their only friends. The city of Raleigh was repeating the mistakes of the colony of soldiers. They were blind men lashing out in the dark. Yet, in the midst of this violence and dread, a spark of pure light appeared. On the 18th of August, 1587, Eleanor Dare, the daughter of John White and wife of the bricklayer Ananias Dare, gave birth to a daughter. She was the first child born to English parents in the Americas. They named her Virginia in honor of the land and the Queen. The baptism of Virginia Dare a few days later was a moment of profound emotion for the colony. It was a declaration of permanence. Soldiers build forts, but families build nurseries. As John White held his granddaughter, he must have felt the crushing weight of the future. This child was not a visitor. She was of this place. Her survival was the only thing that mattered. But survival was becoming a mathematical impossibility. As the summer waned, the settlers took stock of their supplies. They had arrived too late to plant a harvest. The stores they had brought were dwindling, and the salted meat was spoiling in the humid heat. They realized they could not survive the winter, let alone the next year, without support from England. The colonists turned to their governor. They demanded that John White return to England to act as their advocate. They needed him to bypass the greedy investors and go straight to Raleigh to get food, weapons, and reinforcements. White refused. He did not want to leave his daughter and his newborn granddaughter in a war zone. He was afraid that if he left, his name would be tarnished, that people would say he abandoned his post. But the colonists were relentless. They signed a petition begging him to go. "We have no one else," they argued. "You have the ear of Raleigh." With a heavy heart, White capitulated. He spent his last few days on the island making arrangements. He established a protocol for communication. If the colonists were forced to leave the island, a likely scenario given the hostility of the mainland tribes and the lack of food, they were to carve their destination into a tree or a post. If they left in distress, under attack, they were to carve a Maltese cross over the letters. On the 27th of August, John White stood on the beach. The longboat was waiting to take him to the ships. He looked back at the small cluster of cottages, the fragile outpost of Elizabethan England, clinging to the edge of the continent. He saw his daughter Eleanor. He he saw the infant Virginia. He promised them he would be back before Easter. He believed it. He thought he was going on a routine supply run. He climbed into the boat, and the sailors pulled for the open sea. As the coastline of Roanoke receded, becoming a thin line of green against the gray water, John White kept his eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the chimneys. He did not know that he was looking at his family for the last time. He did not know that a storm was gathering in Europe, a storm of iron and gunpowder called the Spanish Armada that would lock the ports of England and turn the Atlantic into a forbidden ocean. The grandfather was leaving to save the child, but history was about to slam the door in his face. John White arrived back in England in November of 1587. He had crossed the Atlantic in a leaky vessel, driven by a single burning purpose: to gather supplies and return immediately to Roanoke. He carried with him the desperate pleas of the 115 settlers and the news of his granddaughter's birth. In his mind, the clock was already ticking. He calculated that the colony had enough food to last perhaps until the harvest of '88. But without new tools, clothing, and livestock, their long-term survival was impossible. He rushed to London to find Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh, ever the visionary, was immediately responsive. He understood the stakes. He ordered a new relief fleet to be prepared at the port of Biddeford under the command of Sir Richard Grenville. White was relieved. It seemed that the crisis would be short-lived. He spent the winter gathering the specific items the settlers had requested: seeds, heavy coats, armor, and paper. He prepared to sail in the spring, imagining the reunion with Eleanor and Virginia. But in the spring of 1588, the world changed. Rumors had been swirling for months, but now they solidified into hard intelligence. King Philip II of Spain was launching the enterprise of England. The Spanish Armada, the greatest invasion fleet in history, was gathering in Lisbon. Its goal was not just to defeat the English navy, but to land an army in Kent, march on London, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism to England at the point of a pike. The English government went into a state of total mobilization. Every serviceable ship, every cannon, and every able-bodied sailor was requisitioned for the defense of the realm. The Privy Council issued a stay of shipping, forbidding any vessel from leaving English ports. The logic was cold and undeniable. England could not spare a single hull for a speculative colony in America when the homeland itself was under threat. John White stood on the docks at Biddeford and watched as the relief fleet, the ships destined for Roanoke, were stripped of their supplies and repurposed for war. The Tiger, the Roebuck, and the others were ordered to join Drake at Plymouth. The food intended for the starving colonists was unloaded to feed the sailors waiting to fight the Spanish. White pleaded with the authorities. He argued that over 100 English subjects were in mortal danger across the ocean. But his voice was drowned out by the drums of war. To the Queen's ministers, the loss of a tiny colony was a regrettable statistic. The loss of England was an apocalypse. Desperate, White used his influence to secure a small concession. He was allowed to take 2 small pinnaces, the Brave and the Roe ships too small to be of use in the battle line, to make a run for Virginia. It was a gamble, but it was his only hope. He loaded them with passengers and supplies and set sail in April. But the curse of Roanoke struck again. The captains of these small ships were not explorers. They were privateers. No sooner had they cleared the English Channel than they turned to piracy, attacking French and Scottish vessels in search of plunder. They were reckless and incompetent. In a battle with 2 French warships, the Brave was battered into submission. The French boarded the ship, looted the cargo, including the supplies for Roanoke, and wounded the captain. White himself was wounded in the head. Limping and humiliated, the ships were forced to return to England. John White had failed. He was back in port, bleeding and empty-handed, while the summer of '88 burned on. He watched from the cliffs as the Spanish Armada swept up the channel, a crescent moon of floating castles. He watched the beacons flare along the coast. He rejoiced, presumably, when the English fire ships scattered the enemy at Gravelines and the Protestant wind drove the wreckage of the Spanish fleet into the North Sea. But while England celebrated its salvation, White knew that for Roanoke, the victory was a disaster. The war dragged on. The seas remained dangerous. The stay of shipping remained in effect. 90, 91, 92 weeks passed. Each week was a sentence of death for the colony. White spent this long silence in a purgatory of bureaucracy. He petitioned the Queen. He petitioned Raleigh. But Raleigh's star was fading. He was losing favor at court and was distracted by his estates in Ireland. The colony of Roanoke became an afterthought, a failed line item in a ledger of grander ambitions. We must imagine the psychological torture of John White during these years. He was a man haunting the docks of London and Plymouth, looking for any captain willing to take him west. He lived with the daily knowledge that his daughter was likely watching the horizon, day after day, waiting for a sail that did not appear. Did they think he had abandoned them? Had they been overrun? Had they starved? The silence from across the Atlantic was absolute. There were no letters, no passing ships bringing news. Just the gray, indifferent ocean. Finally, in the spring of 1590, a window opened. A merchant named John Watts was outfitting a fleet of privateers for the Caribbean. Raleigh, still technically the governor of Virginia, used his remaining influence to cut a deal. He would grant Watts a license to hunt Spanish treasure ships, provided that he took John White and some supplies to Roanoke on the return leg of the voyage. It was a devil's bargain. Watts agreed, but he had no interest in colonization. He viewed White as a nuisance. When the fleet sailed in March, White was a passenger, not a commander. He was alone. There were no new settlers, no reinforcement of soldiers. Just a grandfather with a few chests of supplies, hitching a ride with a gang of legalized pirates. The journey was agonizingly slow. The privateers spent months in the Caribbean, attacking Spanish outposts, chasing galleons, and burning sugar mills. White was forced to watch, helpless, as the summer months, the crucial season for sailing to Virginia, ticked away. He recorded his frustration in his journal, noting how the captains chased every fly of a prize vessel while his family waited. It was not until August hurricane season that the fleet finally turned north toward the Outer Banks. It had been 3 years since White had left, 3 years of silence. As the coastline of North Carolina came into view, the weather began to turn. The sea was rough, the wind howling from the northeast. The captains were anxious. They wanted to drop White off and get back to England before the winter storm set in. On the 15th of August, they anchored off Hatteras. They saw a plume of smoke rising from Roanoke Island in the distance. White's heart leaped. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. He convinced himself it was a signal, a beacon lit by Eleanor to guide him home. The sailors fired a cannon to announce their arrival. They waited for an answer. None came. The next day, White and a landing party boarded 2 small boats to cross the treacherous sound. The tide was running hard. The sea was a churning washing machine of sand and foam. As they tried to negotiate the inlet, disaster struck. One of the boats capsized. 7 men, including the captain of the Hopewell, were drowned. They were dragged down by their armor or smashed against the sandbars. The remaining sailors were terrified. They mutinied, refusing to go further. They blamed White for the deaths. They said the island was cursed. It took all of White's persuasion, and perhaps a reminder of the potential riches left behind by the colonists, to convince them to try one last time. As night fell on the 17th of August, 1590, John White sat in the surviving boat, shivering in the darkness. They anchored just off the shore of Roanoke Island. They could still see the light of a fire in the woods. To reassure the colonists and perhaps to reassure himself, White ordered the men to sound a trumpet. They played English hunting calls, familiar tunes that should have brought the settlers running to the beach. They shouted into the trees, "We are here! It is John White! We have returned!" But the forest swallowed the sound. There was no shout of recognition. No child ran out of the surf. just the sound of the wind in the cedars and the rhythmic, indifferent crash of the waves. The long silence was not broken. It was deepening. White waited for the dawn, staring at the dark shape of the island, terrifyingly close yet infinitely far away, knowing that what he found when the sun rose would determine whether he was a savior or a ghost haunting his own life. The dawn of August the 18th, 1590, broke gray and sullen over the Outer Banks. John White, exhausted and soaked from the rough crossing, stepped onto the sand of Roanoke Island. It had been 3 years since he left this beach. He had promised to return by Easter. He was returning to a world that had moved on without him. The smoke they had seen the night before had vanished. The trumpets had gone unanswered. Now, there was only the physical reality of the place to confront. White led his small party of sailors up the sandy path toward the settlement. As they walked, they noticed fresh footprints in the sand, indigenous prints, presumably, but perhaps those of the colonists? Hope flared, brittle and sharp. They crested the dune and looked down at the site where the city of Raleigh was supposed to be. The houses were gone. The cottages that White had helped repair, the nursery where Virginia Dare had slept, all dismantled. This was not the work of fire or storm. The structures had been taken down deliberately, presumably to be moved. In their place stood a high palisade of heavy timbers, a defensive wall built in the style of a fort. It was a structure born of fear, a fortress for a people who no longer felt safe in their own homes. White approached the entrance of the enclosure. On one of the massive posts near the entrance, the bark had been peeled away. Carved into the bare wood, in capital letters, was a single word, Croatoan. White stopped. He stared at the letters. He remembered the protocol he had established with the colonists 3 years ago. If they moved, they were to carve their destination. Croatoan was the name of the island to the south, modern-day Hatteras, the home of Manteo and his people. It was a friendly destination. Crucially, White scanned the wood for the other sign, the Maltese cross. They had agreed that if the colonists were leaving in distress, forced out by violence or starvation, they would carve a cross above the name. There was no cross. The letters were clean and unaccompanied. A wave of relief washed over White. I greatly joyed that I have found a certain token of their safe being at Croatoan, he later wrote. To him, the message was clear. They had gone to live with Manteo. It made perfect sense. The Croatoan people were allies. Their island was accessible. The food supply there was more stable. The dismantled houses suggested an orderly evacuation, not a panicked flight. The lack of a cross suggested they had left on their own terms. But as the men entered the palisade, the scene became more unsettling. The area inside was overgrown with weeds and tall grass. Nature was already erasing the English footprint. Scattered on the ground were heavy iron bars, pig iron intended for blacksmithing, and 4 small cannon. These were heavy items, too cumbersome to carry on a small boat or trek. They had been left behind. Further searching revealed a more personal tragedy. In a trench near the fort, the sailors found 5 chests that had been buried and then dug up. They had been ransacked. The contents were strewn across the ground books with their covers torn off, maps rotting in the rain, armor rusting in the dirt. White recognized 3 of the chests. They were his own. He found his journals, his drawings, his frames, the intellectual labor of his life, ruined by the elements and the looters. It was a scene of violation. It suggested that after the colonists left, the local tribes, perhaps the hostile Roanokes from the mainland, had come to scavenge. They had dug up the hidden caches, taken what was useful, cloth, tools, weapons, and discarded the useless paper and art. White stood amidst the wreckage of his past, looking at the soggy remains of his watercolors, and realized that even if his family was alive, their connection to England was rotting away. Despite the ominous signs, White was energized. He had a destination. Croatoan was only 50 miles to the south. He hurried back to the ships, eager to tell the captains. The plan was simple. They would sail to Croatoan the next morning, find the colonists, and finally bring them the supplies they had waited 3 years to receive. But the curse of Roanoke was not done with them. As night fell, the wind shifted. The sky turned a bruised purple. A hurricane was spinning off the coast. The ships, anchored in the exposed roadstead, began to pitch violently. The Hopewell, the ship carrying White, lost one of its cables. Then it lost a second anchor. They were down to their last hook, perilously close to being driven onto the shoals that had claimed so many vessels before. The situation was critical. The captain of the Hopewell made a decision based on survival, not sentiment. They could not stay. The weather was too dangerous, and they were running low on fresh water. The cask filled on the island had been knocked overboard in the storm. White pleaded. He begged them to wait out the storm, to just make the short run to Croatoan. But the captains were privateers, not humanitarians. They had their prizes to protect. They agreed to a compromise. They would sail to the West Indies to winter, resupply, and then come back to Croatoan in the spring. It was a lie, or at best, a fantasy. As the ships turned their prows east, away from the American coast, John White must have felt the crushing weight of reality. He was leaving. Again, he was sailing away from his daughter and granddaughter, who were likely alive, just 50 miles down the coast, waiting for him. The journey back to England was a nightmare of storms and failure. The Hopewell was blown all the way to the Azores. They never went back to the West Indies. They never returned to Croatoan in the spring. The ship limped into Plymouth in October of 1590. John White stepped onto the English dock a broken man. He had failed his family twice, once by leaving them and once by returning too late. He would never see America again. He retired to one of Raleigh's estates in Ireland, living out his days in a quiet, haunted obscurity. He wrote a final letter to his friend Richard Hakluyt in 1593, trying to find peace in his faith. He wrote that he committed the relief of my comfortable company to the merciful help of the Almighty. It was the resignation of a man who had done everything humanly possible and had been defeated by the wind, the sea, and the politics of empires. The fort on Roanoke Island stood empty, the word Croatoan slowly fading under the sun and rain. The weeds grew higher, covering the rusted cannon and the torn books. The city of Raleigh had become a ghost town, not because its people were dead, but because the civilization that sent them there had lost the will to find them. They were not lost, they were abandoned. And in that abandonment, the mystery was born not of magic or monsters, but of a father standing on the deck of a retreating ship, watching the coast of Virginia disappear into the mist for the last time. Sir Walter Raleigh never went back to Roanoke. The man who had dreamed of an English empire in the West found himself consumed by the treacherous politics of the East. He fell out of favor with the Queen, was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and became obsessed with a new, feverish dream, the city of El Dorado in South America. But he did not forget the 115 souls he had sent into the wilderness. He claimed to have sent 5 expeditions to look for them between 1590 and 1602. But these were half-hearted gestures, ships that were more interested in harvesting sassafras or hunting Spanish prizes than conducting a manhunt in the deep forests of Carolina. The captains would sail past the Outer Banks, fire a cannon, and when no answer came, they would turn away, absolved of their duty. The Roanoke Colony drifted from a crisis into a legend. It became a ghost story told in London taverns, the story of the lost colony. But 17 years after John White stood before the empty palisade, the English returned to America. In 1607, the Virginia Company established Jamestown, 100 miles to the north in the Chesapeake Bay. The Jamestown settlers were acutely aware of their predecessors. Their instructions from London were explicit: find the survivors. They knew that if any of the Roanoke settlers were still alive, they would possess 20 years of survival knowledge that could save the struggling Jamestown colony from starvation. Captain John Smith and the Secretary William Strachey began to gather intelligence from the local Powhatan tribes. The reports they heard were tantalizing. Indigenous traders spoke of clothed men living in the interior. They spoke of houses built of stone and of people who kept tame turkeys. Strachey reported that there were 7 English survivors living under the protection of a chief named Roanoke, preserving the ritual of beating copper, perhaps working metal in the European style. But then, the story took a darker turn. Chief Powhatan, the paramount ruler of the region and father of Pocahontas, gave a chilling confession to Captain Smith. He claimed that the Roanoke settlers had indeed moved north, attempting to settle with the Chesapeakean tribe near the Chesapeake Bay, the very destination John White had originally intended for them. Powhatan, seeing the Chesapeakeans and their new white allies as a threat to his dominance, claimed he had slaughtered them all. To prove it, he showed Smith several English iron musket barrels and a brass mortar. For centuries, historians accepted this confession as the final answer. It was a convenient, if tragic, ending. The savages had killed the civilizers. It fit the narrative of the inevitable conflict between the two worlds. But modern archaeology and a closer reading of the history suggest that Powhatan may have been lying or at least exaggerating to intimidate Smith. He was saying, essentially, "Look what I did to the last white men who tried to live here." The physical evidence tells a different story. No mass grave has ever been found near the Chesapeakean lands. No burned English city has been unearthed in the Chesapeake. And the message on the tree, Croatoan, remains the most stubborn piece of evidence. John White believed it. He believed they had gone south to Hatteras Island to live with Manteo. This leads us to the most plausible, yet most often ignored, theory: assimilation. The Roanoke settlers did not vanish into thin air. They vanished into the gene pool. It is likely that the colony splintered. One group may have gone north and been killed by Powhatan, but a larger group almost certainly went south to Croatoan. There, isolated from England, starving and desperate, they did what human beings have always done to survive. They adapted. They shed their heavy wool clothes for deer skins. They abandoned their useless muskets for bows. They married into the Croatoan and Secondin families. They ceased to be English subjects and became Americans. In the early 18th century, when European settlers began to push into the interior of North Carolina, they encountered the Tuscarora and the Lumbee peoples. They were astonished to find indigenous people with gray eyes, light hair, and English surnames, names like Bear, White, Cooper, and Stevens. These people spoke a dialect of English that preserved Elizabethan pronunciations. They claimed that their ancestors could talk in a book. The Lumbee tribe today maintains a strong oral tradition that they are the descendants of the Roanoke settlers who merged with the indigenous population. For the English of the Victorian era, this was an uncomfortable truth. They preferred the mystery of the lost colony, a romantic tragedy of noble martyrs, to the reality of mixed blood. The idea that English women had married indigenous men and raised indigenous children disrupted the racial hierarchy of the empire. It was easier to believe they were dead than to believe they had gone native. The hunger for a dramatic solution has spawned countless hoaxes. In the 1930s, a series of stones, the Dare Stones, surfaced in Georgia and the Carolinas. They were inscribed with messages purportedly carved by Eleanor Dare, detailing the death of her husband and child and her flight into the interior. The public was captivated. It was the diary of the lost, written in stone. But forensic analysis eventually exposed them as forgeries, created by a stonecutter looking for fame and money. The hoax revealed something profound about us. We want the story to continue. We want to hear Eleanor Dare's voice. We cannot accept the silence. But in the 21st century, the silence is being broken by science. The Lost Colony DNA Project is currently using advanced genetic testing to trace the Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA of families in North Carolina, looking for the genetic markers of the 1587 roster. And archaeology has finally moved beyond Roanoke Island. At a location known as Site X in Bertie County, inland from the coast, Archaeologists have recently discovered Elizabethan pottery borderware that dates specifically to the late 16th century. It was found in association with indigenous artifacts. It is not a trade good. It is domestic pottery, the kind used by families. It suggests that a group of survivors moved inland, settling near the Chalon River, living quietly among the local tribes, possibly for a generation or more. The vanishing of the Roanoke Colony is not a mystery of supernatural abduction. It is a tragedy of abandonment. The 115 men, women, and children were the victims of a geopolitical gamble. They were placed on a chessboard by Sir Walter Raleigh, and then the Queen decided that the game was no longer worth the candle. They waited for 3 years for a sale that never came. And when they realized they had been forsaken, they took down their houses, carved a sign to tell their father where they were going, and walked into the forest. They did not die. They transformed. The blood of Virginia Dare likely still runs in the veins of the people of North Carolina. The lost colony is a misnomer. They were only lost to England. To America, they were the first immigrants, the first to realize that to survive in the New World, you could not simply transplant the old. You had to become something new. If you stand on the shores of Roanoke Island today, at the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, you will see a reconstructed earthwork and a theater that performs the story every summer. But the true monument is the silence of the woods. It is a silence that holds the memory of a betrayal, the memory of a grandfather's grief, and the quiet, unrecorded courage of a group of people who looked at the horizon, saw it was empty, and decided to save themselves.